Xollie Duncan. I was born in 1954 in Benton County, and I mean literally in the county. The doctor came out to our house, delivered me in the country west of Gravette. I call it a house, it was more of a shack, but anyway, I grew up there. Lived my whole life essentially in Gravette. Went to school there, high school. Not kindergarten. We didn't have kindergarten in those days. First grade through 12th grade at Gravette. And my mom and dad farmed our whole lives.
So tell me, what was it like back in those days growing up in Gravette, or I guess you were out in the country? What was it like back then?
Well, it was country. I mean, we farmed my whole life. My mom and dad we were really poor. I probably didn't realize it, but I obviously I do now. Of course, everybody in Gravette was poor. Nobody had any money. It was hard to scratch out a living. I think my dad did an interview for the Benton County Oral History project as well over at Gravette. And I mean, he was talking about how difficult it was to make a living back then. And he was just sort of trying to scratch out what he could. But he worked all his life. When he was 12, he left home and went to Kansas to the broom corn harvest. And he worked from the time he was 12 until basically he retired, He ran cattle till he died 3 years ago. So he called it retirement, although I don't think he ever really retired. But he worked at the Gravette shelling plant, which was the place that took in black walnuts, and they shelled them. They did all kinds of stuff with the actual shells as well as the nut itself. But they ground up those shells and shipped it out on the railroad for all kinds of different purposes. He worked there when I was little, but also we farmed the whole time. We farmed, and they kind of scraped together enough money to buy our home place eventually, where I think we moved there when I was 6, and then I grew up the rest of the time there. I had 3 brothers and a sister. My youngest brother, I was 16 when he was born, so I was just there a little while before I went to college, and went to school. First started college at Russellville and then transferred to the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. I started law school in 76, graduated in 79, passed the bar, luckily, thank you, and started practicing in Rogers. I got a job with Don Kendall and Doug Schrantz, worked there. Doug was the city attorney, so I practiced mostly in municipal court, prosecuting the city cases there. Eventually came to the county prosecutor's office.
So when did you come to the county prosecutor's office, and what was it like then?
Well, it was not nearly the caseload as it is now. I started in the prosecutor's office in January of 1981. And like David said, Don Lehman had just been murdered right before I came to work. I think I came to work about the 18th of January, and he had just been murdered. So eventually Ray Bunch, who was a deputy then, and I got involved in the preparation of that trial. Right after I came to work at the prosecutor's office, and I was still learning the ropes on felony prosecutions and bond hearings and all the preliminary things that you have to do for felony cases, I was still kind of learning the ropes, and I was attacked at Walmart, and a man attempted to kidnap me. And so that kind of threw everybody off. It was a very unusual situation. Walmart was north of town at that time, and I just stopped there to get a small notepad because I was going to go to it's the county building on 102. The 4-H was meeting there, and I was going to go out there and give them a talk. They wanted to hear about crime and criminals. And in the meantime, before I could get there, this guy came up to my car and tried to get in with me. And he had a knife and a frog gig. And so we had a tussle and a fight, and eventually I got away from him. And so that was, I'd been here a month. I'd been at the prosecutor's office a month when that happened to me. They caught the guy. When I finally pushed him off of me, I ran around behind. Got in a car, and I ran around behind the car and got his license number. Went down to the payphone in front of the Walmart store. There was a guy talking on the phone, and I'd been screaming, "Call the police, call the police." And everybody was just looking at me. There were like 3 or 4 people out there just looking at me. And so when I ran up there, he was holding the phone. I said, "Are you calling the police?" He said, "No, I'm talking to my wife." I said, "Well, give me the phone. I got to call the police." Eventually, they caught the guy in Rogers at the Walmart there and arrested him. We had to have that trial. We had that sometime in the, I want to say in the summer. It happened in 81. I want to say we had that trial before we started the Lehman trial. I mean, it came to court really quick. That may not be right. My memory may be faulty on that. But anyway, that guy got convicted of attempted kidnapping and sent off to prison. But so that was a baptism by fire into felony cases for me.
Did he say why he did it?
No. He said at one point while he was on the attack, I thought he was about to get into the car with me, and I was afraid that I kept thinking to myself, if he gets me out of this parking lot, I'm dead. And so I said, "Here, you can have my purse, you can have my car." He said, "That's not what I want." And then when one of the investigators that was talking to him, I guess the investigators that caught him in Rogers with Mike Jones and Gary Armstrong, they brought him to Benton County to the jail. And Don Townsend, who was investigator with the sheriff's office, was interviewing him. Don Townsend was really, really good. And he was really good at interviewing people. And he kept trying to find out from him, what was your purpose? And he said, "It's too awful, I can't talk about it." And so, anyway, that was one trial we had that year. And then Ray and I were involved in getting ready the rest of that year, the rest of 81, in preparing the Don Lehman case to go to trial. So then I spent 6 years at the prosecutor's office before I went into private practice. I left in 1987 to go into private practice. 1986 was the year we tried those Sunshine School cases, and it took essentially all year to try them. And it was an exhausting time, and it was an exhausting year because we tried so many of those cases, and we were trying them essentially back to back. And those kids did a marvelous job, but it was really difficult. So anyway, I left in 1987, went to private practice.
We talked about that case in some other interviews we've done, but can you kind of just summarize what it was and what your role in it was?
Well, I was the deputy prosecutor, so I was investigating with Mike Sidoriak, who was the Benton County deputy, who was the detective at that time. And he and I were interviewing. We interviewed everybody. We interviewed parents, and we interviewed the children. We interviewed the teachers. We basically were at the Sunshine School several days a week, all day long. And so one thing that we always did in preparation for these cases was work hand in hand with the police. Whichever agency was involved in the investigation of the case, in the bigger cases, we always worked hand in hand with them. And so it wasn't just you investigators work the case, you bring it to us, we'll prosecute it. It never was like that. You were always involved, and you never stopped investigating, ever. The case was never completed until the trial was done. So that it was very, very often we would be interviewing people and continuing to investigate even while the trial was going on. So that was one method of making sure that you knew as much about the defendant's case as you possibly could, and that you were prepared for whatever they wanted to throw at you. So but anyway, 1981 is the big Don Lehman case, besides others, and then 86 was the Sunshine School case, and 87 I went to private practice.
So, what are some of the cases you handled in private practice during that time before you became a judge? Were there any big ones that you remember?
I didn't get into criminal cases. I went into family law, and I practiced here in Bentonville. And so, much to my surprise, that's what my practice turned out to be. I assumed when I left the prosecutor's office that probably I would do criminal cases, and I did do some. But mostly I did family law, and I was so busy. There was so much to do because the population was starting to ramp up and grow. And so that kept me busy for the 15 years that I was in private practice. As a matter of fact, David had mentioned the Gary Ward case. Peggy Ward, who had been Peggy Mayo, had come to me to file the divorce. She also came back to me and said, I'm dismissing the divorce because Gary Ward had essentially turned the children against her. And she couldn't bear that the children were buying into Gary's side. Now, Gary was persuasive. And so eventually she went back to him. And then when she separated from him again is when the murder occurred. But the children had figured it out by that time. They figured out who was the bad actor in the marriage.
Back in the day when you were doing your prosecutions and deputy prosecuting, who are some of the attorneys that you dealt with that stand out, some of the memories, the memorable ones?
Well, David Matthews, of course. We had Jerry Don Newman was a guy who had committed an armed robbery. And he went to David, hired David, and David was convinced that he was not guilty. And he kept hammering at me that you've got the wrong man, you're prosecuting an innocent man. And I said, I don't think so, David. If I thought that, I wouldn't be prosecuting him. So eventually we go to trial, we have a jury trial, we get a conviction, the guy gets 10 years in the penitentiary for robbing a little convenience store in Rogers. And there were some little ripples during that case, but eventually the trial was over, his man was convicted, and I always watched the appeals. And so I want to make sure if a case was appealed that the Attorney General got it and got on it because they represented the state when cases were appealed to the Court of Appeals or Supreme Court. So the 30 days passed after the judgment was and conviction was entered, and the notice of appeal wasn't filed. So I saw David in the courthouse one day, and I said, hey, you didn't get your notice of appeal filed. And he said, do you know, that guy came in to me later and asked me to represent him on Washington County robbery cases he'd just been arrested on, and he admitted he did them all. So he was really kind of taken aback by that. But anyway, he was just really irked by the guy. And I think by being taken in by him, that he convinced him he was not guilty. WHE was always a fun one to try cases against. The Sunshine School case that Everett was involved in, that was fun. It was, you just get into trying cases against these guys, and when it's a challenge, it is a good learning experience, but it also makes you step up your game a little bit if you get the good ones on there. One of the cases, of course, we had Carroll County at the time, and so we had to try cases over there as well. One of them was a drug case. It was a man and woman, and Bill Putman was representing the woman charged with possession of drugs, I think. But back in the day, that was bad, and it was some kind of meth, speed, something, not just marijuana. and Putnam was representing her, and so we tried that one, and Putnam was on. He was always on. He was so good at what he did. But one thing, and one of his strong suits was having his witnesses prepared for cross-examination. But when the woman got on the stand, and Putnam had her she was good, and he led her through what happened and why she had this why she had these drugs, and she was explaining it was just given to her by a friend because it was diet medicine. She was taking it as diet medicine, and so what Putnam had missed, I don't know how, was he didn't have her cover how she took the diet medicine. And so when David got up to cross-examine, he said, "How did you use this? How did you take it?" And she goes, "Up my nose," which is how you snort the coke. And so the jury was done right there. Oh, Putnam was so angry. We were talking later at his client, because after the trial was over, he wanted to buy drinks for everybody. And he was so mad at her. He said, could she have said she stirred it up in her Coke or in her coffee? Anything but up her nose. So we had a big laugh at it. Those were the kind of fun things behind the scenes.
Some of the ones we've interviewed have talked about when David Klinger was prosecutor and you worked for him, how he was known for just meticulous preparation. That's what the defense attorneys have said. So can you address that?
Oh, we meticulously prepared. Yes, we did. Every one of us. Ray knew how to do it. Ray, when he was the chief deputy, because he'd been there longer than me, and so he and I worked on cases together, but for every single case, you had a witness outline for every witness, yours and the defense witnesses. So you had a witness outline, you knew everything they had said to everybody, you knew every piece of evidence, and in that Lehman case, there were hundreds of pieces of evidence. We had charts of the chain of evidence, which we had to prove. So everybody that had handled that piece of evidence, how it got from the scene of the crime to the first investigator to the crime lab, from the crime lab back to the investigator, into the evidence locker, out of the evidence locker, into the courtroom. So for hundreds of pieces of evidence, but we had all of it mapped out, and we did that on every single case. So yeah, we prepared. And like I said, we investigated even during the trial. We may be interviewing people, something may have come up that nobody had thought to do. It was rare, but it happened. And we would send an investigator out to do this, or find this witness, or this, check out this particular place that hasn't been photographed, or, constantly. It never stopped until the jury came back in.
How did working as a prosecutor prepare you to be a judge?
Well, it's not just being a prosecutor, but being in private practice, where you figure out, and I think the good attorneys do this, they figure out that there's another side to that story, and I better be figuring out what it is before I go to court. That's being an attorney is for all those years, and sometimes new attorneys don't really get that right away. And so being an attorney for a period of time, and being in the prosecutor's office and preparing like we did, like I said, we had a witness statement, not only an outline for our witnesses, but for all the defense witnesses too. So there's another side to the story. You figure out what those both sides are, so that when you get to court, you pretty well know what they're going to say. And if you do that, when you're on the bench, one thing you have to remember is, okay, I heard your story, and I wonder what the other side's going to say that's going to make this not look quite so bad. And sure enough, there's always another side. So you just remember that, and being an attorney, that even in private practice, I always try to do the same thing. Prepare. Have your case put together, have your subpoenas out, make sure you got all those witnesses that are going to be there, and that they're prepared to testify. They know what you're going to ask them. They know what's probably coming at them from the other side. So they're ready. They've been woodshedded. They know not to fight with the other side, but just realizing there are two sides and you better be ready to listen to both of them. That prepares you to be on the bench.
Back in the day, Benton County had one, maybe two judges, and now
We have 7.
yes. So talk about just this. We know the population growth and this rising caseload. How are y'all dealing with that?
Well, when I first took the bench, which was in 2000, Governor Huckabee appointed me, and Judge Adams, who was my predecessor, was very well liked, and he worked hard. And so there wasn't a huge backlog when I came in, but the caseload was getting much bigger at that time. It had started really growing. The civil cases, which were handled not by the chancellors, we handled probate and domestic. The circuit judges, we had a distinct division, you know about that. The circuit judges handled all the civil cases and all the criminal cases. Well, the criminal cases took priority. And to be honest, some of the circuit judges didn't care that much for civil cases. And they didn't get the priority. And so the civil cases were backlogged just terribly. I think they were backlogged terribly when David took the bench. And so he started working through that. And eventually then in 2002, when Amendment 80 passed, and we were all then circuit judges, and we redistributed the load so that the chancellors were no longer chancellors. We're all circuit judges. We all have the same jurisdiction, and we could take some of those civil cases. So we redistributed all of that, and the chancellors then started hearing civil cases. And that really, I think, alleviated the criminal courts so that they could push the criminal cases through, which they, by law, are required to do. And it helped everybody get things pushed through. But the caseload in 2000 was really starting to get big. So when we got another judge, it made an immediate impact when we could get another person to help with the load.
You mentioned earlier that whenever you were a prosecutor in the prosecutor's office, you guys worked hand in hand with the law enforcement. Mm-hmm. Do you see that now?
Not so much. I think they're much more insulated from each other. I don't think it, and I'm not sure that it worked that way in other prosecutors' offices. I just know it did in this one. And Mike Jones, Gary Armstrong, in Rogers, Bill Peters, Dennis Spradlin, Jerry Williams in Bentonville. We were all on first name basis. Don Townsend, Gene Drake, Bruce Rutherford, Mike Sidoriak at the Sheriff's Office, Al Gregory, Kevin Hobbs at Siloam, Kenny Farmer at Bella Vista. We were just all on first name basis. And as a matter of fact, there was a prosecutor on call, a deputy prosecutor on call always at night, on weekends. And if there was a murder or any kind of more serious or more involved crime, that prosecutor that was on call went to the scene, and you worked with the police at the scene. So that was just the way the job was done when I was there. And I thought it worked very well because you were in at on the ground floor, and sometimes a prosecutor can point out things to a police officer that he may not otherwise have noticed. I'm going to need this for court. So,
is there anything you want to say maybe that I haven't thought to ask about, or anything that's important or memorable?
I just think that with the growth in Benton County, that cases they were starting to pile up again on the judges, and that will continue because we're going to continue with our growth in Benton County. David was saying that this used to be rural. I loved it when it was rural. I'm from the country. I like the country. I lived west of Bentonville, 6 miles. That used to be the country. It's not anymore. And so I was surrounded by subdivisions. So we moved further out so we could be back in the country. I like that. We live on Spavinaw. It's great. We have the creek right there, and I love that. But if you're more urban, I mean, Bentonville and Rogers has everything you could want right here. So,
Now, if somebody came to you who'd never been to Benton County and said, Judge Duncan, tell me about your home county, Benton County, Arkansas, what would you tell them?
well, I guess it's got everything to offer you could possibly want, in my humble opinion. If you want city, you've got everything in Bentonville and Rogers, biking trails. If you want outdoor life, you've got it. You've got the lake, you've got rivers, you've got the creek, you've got all kinds of outdoor activities in Benton County. These biking trails, evidently, I'm not a biker, but evidently these biking trails are fantastic. But you've also got arts, music. You know, the Waltons are bringing in all kinds of big names, the AMP, and all kinds of places that you can get any of the arts, from the museum, the momentary, kid activities, the museum, all kinds of things for the kids. The water splash park here, and evidently there's more going in every day. So I see hotels being built right over there where there used to be, you know, a quiet street. But also, if you want to be out, there are still some rural pockets here that you can find. I found one, and we moved there, but there are fewer of them. So, but you can find them, and if you like the country, you can be in the country.
One last question here. My favorite thing about, finish this sentence for me, and you can make it as short or as long as you want. My favorite thing about Benton County is?
Probably the diversity of activities that I was just talking about. So you can be in whichever setting you want to be. You can be in the outdoors, you can be in the arts district, you can be doing sports, fishing, the lake, any number of things. So I like that. All these places we had to eat. When I first came to Bentonville, I don't know how big the population was, but not much. The courthouse was the only thing downtown. And when the courthouse was closed, the whole square was closed. There was nothing going on down here. There were no cars parked around the square. At 4:30, when the courthouse closed and you walked out to get in your car to go home, your car was the only one left. It was only county employees. And there weren't very many of those. So, but by the time Judge Enfield had left, there were 2 other judges by then, and things had already started changing. And now that we have 7 judges and all this population, we'll have more judges here, because with the population growth, the case numbers grow, and that's at least now how judges are being selected. So there will be more and more judges because there's more and more population. So we're going to grow.